Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. And tonight it's going to be a bit of a blast from the past. Now, just so people understand how long we've been doing live streams on Loving Life TV, back in 2019, pre-COVID, I had a live stream with a fellow by the name of Colin Weir. And Colin heads up an organization called Flight Safety that investigates plane and helicopter crashes around the world. Our discussion regarding Adam Voss, who headed up South African Airways Technical at that time, caused a rumpus at South African Airways and all sorts of threats that went absolutely nowhere. Those were the days of Dudu Myeni. Remember that? That's when South African Airways was just still running. Now, tonight we will pick up the story because it needs to be told. We will also be covering other serious issues regarding air safety in South Africa and topical issues regarding air safety going forward. One of the accidents that Colin investigated was the tragic crash landing of a Garuda Airlines passenger plane some years back. Let's have a look at that. Here we go. And I've got to tell you, the footage is quite graphic, but not too graphic. But just be warned. Here we go.
As many as 49 people have been killed and more than 70 injured in a plane crash in Indonesia. There were at least 9 Australians on board the plane and 4 of them are missing. The Australians were travelling to Yogyakarta for a meeting of Indonesian and Australian government ministers, but their plane overshot the runway and burst into flames. Indonesia correspondent Jeff Thompson reports.
These are the first moments of the doomed Garuda flight, just after it crash-landed at Yogyakarta Airport. Witnesses said the plane appeared to overshoot the runway before crashing and bursting into flames. Airport staff and emergency workers were able to drag some of the survivors from the wreckage before the flames overtook it.
One of my colleagues, he kind of told everybody to stay calm and to leave their belongings, and then I don't think we were really, well, people were panicked but not really chaotic, so I think quite a lot of people were able to get out of the plane.
But many were trapped inside. Television cameraman Wyan Sukado was a passenger, seated near the rear of the plane. He was able to capture these images of the disaster.
I came out from the emergency window, and all passengers out from there.
Soon the flames had spread through the wreckage, and it was clear no more survivors would be walking out. Instead, body bags were prepared.
But given the severity of the crash and the following fire and the like, it's a situation where we should be prepared for bad news.
The plane's passengers, including Australian media, police and diplomatic staff, were arriving in Yogyakarta for a planned visit by Foreign Minister Alexander Downer.
Of those 9 Australians, 4 of them at the moment are unaccounted for.
Sydney Morning Herald journalist Cynthia Banham was among the passengers. She's reportedly in intensive care in Yogyakarta, suffering from burns.
She's stable, but she's sustained some quite serious injuries and serious burns.
This is the third terrifying aeroplane incident in Indonesia in as many months. The latest disaster is certain to put intense pressure on Indonesia to improve its disastrous public transport record. Jeff Thompson, ABC News, Jakarta.
Okay, so that gives you a bit of the background to the subject we're going to be covering tonight, which is obviously accidents, what causes them, the failings of the technical people, and all that sort of stuff. Without any further ado, let me get our guest on. That's Colin Weir, and here we go. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Scott.
How are you?
Good day. How are you?
Excellent, thanks, buddy. Excellent. Long time since we had you on Loving Life TV. I think it was back in about 2019.
That's correct, and it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you very much for the invitation, and a greeting to all your viewers.
Fantastic. Now, Colin, before we get into what happened with that Garuda Airlines crash, which I played some video footage of, perhaps you'd just like to outline your work and your area of speciality.
We're mainly involved in auditing and accident investigations and legal work. We're also involved in training. We do training for various aspects of offshore helideck and onshore helipad design, and mainly the design and the structure of helipads, both surface level and elevated. So that means ground level and also the hospital helipad. So we've been very involved with a very wide, broad spectrum of aviation for a long time. In fact, I've been involved in aviation for 62 years. So
wow.
That's given me a good insight into what was happening in the early days and how it's evolved into the situation we're in now.
Yeah. Look, we'll go back over some of those plane accidents and helicopter accidents in a minute, but can we focus first off on that Garuda accident where the plane overshot the runway and I think about 46 people died? Do you want to, because you were involved in that investigation, weren't you?
We were. Flight safety was called in to do an investigation in the methodology that we use, which is HFIX, human factors, and also the systems investigation to go from the accident site back through the systems to see where all the failures happened, and in terms of Professor James Reason, the Swiss cheese model, to how everything lined up to cause this dreadful accident. So we did 2 trips across to Jakarta. We always audit and investigate with two people. We went across, did the investigation in Jakarta, went back again later on, because what we found in the first investigation was that the Yogyakarta airport at the time of the accident was not licensed.
Wow.
Its license approval had run out. So we then insisted that we go to Jakarta to do the investigation there to confirm all of this, which we did, and we confirmed it. And so that was the sort of backdrop to what happened there. But in terms of the result of the accident investigation, it was very, very interesting, because this was the first time that we came across this insidious, nasty issue that's crept in everywhere now, and that's incentive bonuses. So in that investigation process, we found that the piloting command was on a fuel incentive bonus scheme. In other words, he had been given the incentive to save fuel, and he would get a commission on the amount of fuel that he saved. So that definitely added to his, in the approach, that added to his absolute insistence on getting the aircraft onto the ground rather than overshooting and going around again and using a lot more fuel. So that was one of the issues. Then we also went back again, and this time I took with me one of the gentlemen that works for us, who's very well known in aviation circles globally and in Africa, Air Force and everywhere else, South African Airways, and that's Johan Smuffy. Came across, and we started looking into the aspect of the simulated training, and we found huge flaws in the failure of the simulated training processes that they had in place. So, to cut a long story short, what happened in the conference room at the end of all of this was that we got them to change their documentation to say that the first officer who had been trying to get the piloting command to go around, to get him to give him the right to enforce the fact of telling the piloting command what to do, because with the crew gradient in that sort of environment, the first officer never questions the piloting command. So we brought in extra wording which said the first officer has the right, and he must, and if he does not challenge and force the situation, then action will be taken against him. So this was brought in as a mechanism to protect him and to enforce that aspect. So that sort of wrapped up the accident investigation as we did it.
Wow. So your actual findings are often brought into law around the world when it comes to planes.
Well, in this case, if we find a serious failure, it's changed in the standards, the operational procedures, and if necessary, it'll go further into the accident investigation boards and the Civil Aviation Authority. But usually it's the standards and the operational processes where we have the most beneficial effect, where we change things.
Right. Now, before we move on to South Africa and issues related to that area, staying with Indonesia, there was that plane a couple of years ago now that took off from, I think it was from Australia, and I think it was a Garuda or an Indonesian plane that flew, and I think they'd landed somewhere in Indonesia. They took off, and then they disappeared over the Indian Ocean. What happened there? Because I never really, there never seemed to be any closure on that.
Well, they've never conclusively confirmed what it was, but by logical deduction, it could only be one thing. And we've been on the news media here before with this on quite a few occasions as well. It could only be a murder-suicide. Once you add everything up in the processes and what happened, that is the only logical explanation as to what it could be.
So what happened was the pilot, I believe, locked himself in his compartment by himself, or in the cockpit by himself, and then just put it on a autopilot until it ran out of gas. Is that what happened?
That's exactly right, and that's why, with the wreckage that's been found, the indications are exactly along those lines. So they keep on reviving this so-called search, and with new theories, which and we've been on the media with this as well, and which is quite sad, because unless they really have something conclusive, you don't want to give, the families hope that something could be found. Until they've got something concrete and they can actually do it and find it, it's better to keep quiet. So there's been quite a lot of reports over here as well about various aspects, startling discoveries and all this, but that should not happen until they have conclusively deduced where it is.
Didn't they find bits of the plane coming up or washing up at Madagascar?
Yes, they did. Yes, that's correct.
And that was years later, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
So obviously the plane, because there were some theories that the plane had been hijacked and landed somewhere in Tibet or something like that for a moment, but obviously that's not the case.
No, I'll just add one more ingredient into that, because with all these audits we do, we insist on global positioning or flight following systems.
Sure.
And that aircraft had ACAS. It had a system on board that could report back as to exactly where they were all the time. But the problem with those systems is that you pay for what they call each ping. So every time it pings, if it's an airline operation with long distance, it costs a lot of money. So they tend to not take up that option on the software. But if they had something like a spider track system, which I had on my Cessna 182 over here, which cost $900 in the back of the aircraft so that the crew couldn't interfere with it, you could look on your phone now and see exactly where that aircraft is.
Wow. So do all international flying planes have that device now?
No, they don't. They have the automatic notification from an engine functional and that sort of thing, and they can have the system active on the flights that they are involved in, but it's not mandatory that they have it and they have it active at all times. Believe it or not, it's absolutely amazing.
That's crazy. Now look, I've gone and looked at Flight Tracker 24 from time to time, and that's fascinating because you see all the planes flying all over the world. Are you saying that some planes which carry passengers aren't even on that because their pinging device is not working?
No, all regular public transport aircraft have to have a transponder active and functional at all times. And if a transponder is functional, then Flight Tracker will pick it up. The only time that does not happen is with police or military operations, where they have a concession to switch the transponder off so they can't be followed.
Right. Now, look, I just want to move on to South Africa because when we last spoke, we were basically looking into some rather dodgy stuff involving Adam Voss, who had just been appointed head of South African Airways Technical. And perhaps you can just take us through what happened when he was working at Newcrest and the helicopter accident, just where this guy obviously wasn't up to the job that he was given with South African Airways when you look at his track record. Do you want to just take us through that?
Well, it's a long, involved story. I'll try and shorten it down to the absolute fact. So I got involved with Adam Voss in about 2004. Newcrest called us in to act as their aviation advisors. I got on very well with him. I even did an audit with him up in Brisbane. We did a maintenance audit together. I got on extremely well with him. He's actually a very nice guy. But unfortunately, as sometimes happens in the management hierarchy, people go up the ladder, and then whatever causes these sort of unfortunate issues to happen, he ended up as general manager of Halmahera Island, or the operation with the gold mining over there. And what happened was I wrote a standard for them, and this standard that I wrote was all-inclusive, how the crews, it had to be two crew, had to be equipped with certain equipment, how they operated under instrument flight rules, etc., as we always do them, as is done around the world with companies like Shell, and all these companies do it. And they accepted it, they signed off on it. And this went on for probably about a year, and then suddenly I got a call from Adam to say, he wanted me to change the standard because they wanted to cover themselves flying one crew only. They didn't want to fly IFR because it was too expensive with training, and certain equipment they didn't want to fit on the aircraft because it was expensive. To cut a long story short, then followed a long, involved interaction between myself and them and Adam's immediate superiors, John Dickinson and Tim Lahaney, where they argued with Adam to say that I needed to be listened to. We brought in two independent people from the outside, two specialists in Australia who supported me 100%, but Adam insisted on changing it. So with the safety manager in Melbourne, they rewrote and they changed my standard. And I've got all this documentation. I've got the original one I wrote. I've got the one that they changed. They changed it to dilute, water down the safety margins to save money, and that led to the accident.
So what happened with the accident?
So with the accident, they took off from Manado in a Bell 412 to fly out to Halmahera, as they always do, taking the workers out. There were two South Africans on board as well. And they were held on the runway for a while because there was a Twin Otter coming in that was on an IFR flight plan, so they held them back. Eventually, when they got airborne, he flew out, the pilot flew out in the route he always flew, which was between a volcano and a high-rising ground to his port side. But on this occasion, when he flew on the heading that he flew into cloud, and what he didn't take into account was that there was a wind blowing from starboard to port, and it blew him to the port side, and he flew into the top of a hill, and 9 people died on impact. 1 person survived. They got the aircraft down, or got the injured passenger down early in the morning at probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. But he died when they got him down to the hospital. So the issue there was also that they were supposed to have a proper GPS flight tracking system on board, which they had on board, but they didn't pay for the ping rate. So there wasn't an emergency man-down warning when the aircraft crashed, as should happen.
Oh, wow.
Only when it was overdue did they start searching.
Wow. Now, okay, so basically your job is to give specialist expert advice on how to actually manage flights in a particular type of environment. That's what you do.
That's right.
And what had happened here was that Adam Voss had gone against your recommendations, and as a direct result of that, this helicopter crashed.
That's correct. And of course, over all that time, I collected all the emails, every single piece of evidence relating to that I've kept on record here, even to the point that the ABC TV people in Melbourne wanted to do a presentation on it, and I flew the gentleman that interviewed me in my Cessna 182 up at Mangalore Airport. We came down to Essendon. We did a whole day of interviews where I exposed everything down to the last detail with the backup evidence. And when that was over, they were supposed to send me a letter to say, or a notification to say that, okay, now it was going to be shown and that they would cover me legally in case there was any legal action taken against me. And I never got that letter, so I never allowed them to show it. But that's sitting on the shelf.
Sorry, guys, we just got a little internet glitch here. You're back, Colin. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
So you were just saying that you told them they couldn't go ahead because they wouldn't give you the letter. Yeah, back to you.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay, now look, there's a bit of a postscript in all this, because what happened was Adam Voss landed up being head of South African Airways Technical a couple of years later. Were there any issues while he was there?
Well, in terms of the news reports, I wasn't directly involved in anything to do with that. I've only followed the news reports that have come through. But of course, there was a lot of news reporting. You've only got to do a search on Adam Voss, South African Airways Technical Services, and all of those reports will come up. Allegedly, in the final phase of his involvement there was talk of some sort of corruption with the exiting CEO or whoever she was, and there was an issue with a payment that was made that was irregular in nature, in that it had been signed off against the wishes of the board, but they went ahead anyway and signed off on it, and she got a very, very large payout. What happened with that, I have no idea. That's as far as we can follow it to that point, except that by that stage, he had left South Africa. He wasn't living in South Africa anymore. He'd gone back to Brisbane. He was running the whole show from Brisbane, which is irregular in itself.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, while you're talking, I'm just playing that or showing that NUMSA SACA press release talking about the money and talking about pressure by NUMSA and SACA. This is back in, I think, 2017 that they're talking about here, but obviously it goes much later than that. But yeah, it's a lengthy article, and the headline on that article is NUMSA and SACA demand South African Airways Technical CEO Adam Voss and board member Thandika Umgoduso must be urgently investigated for corruption at South African Airways Technical. Now, he as you mentioned, he came back to Brisbane. I think this is in the early part of COVID. I think he flew back to Australia. But he's now got another job, hasn't he?
Apparently, in terms of his LinkedIn site, he's the COO of Jaramco in Jordan. He's a very capable fellow. So to run those engineering jobs, he's probably a very, very good choice, as long as everything stays on the straight and narrow. But just one interesting thing in passing, that if you look at his LinkedIn site, there's a gap of a couple of years. In fact, quite
7
a few
years.
Yeah, from the 2004 to 2011, and that's when he was with Newcrest.
But when the accident happened.
Yeah, that's correct. That's been taken out of his LinkedIn site. So the rest is all engineering and head of engineering, so on and so forth. So that particular section has been taken out for some reason.
Right. Okay. Well, I can understand why he did that. Now, there was another accident at Louis Botha Airport. Do you want to take us through that and what that was all about?
Well, that's very, very interesting. What happened with that accident was that the brother of the deceased pilot, Alistair Freeman, he contacted us quite a few years ago. He sent us all the information relevant to the accident. He had also followed it up with the South African Civil Aviation Authority, and he had tried to rectify what he saw as an unfair analysis on what had happened, in that his brother, who was now deceased, had been blamed for the accident.
Right.
So we started investigating it from our side, and it was a very interesting exercise, because not often can you get the information gathered after an accident and the accident report to actually sit back and say absolutely 100% conclusively that was the incorrect result. He did not inadvertently shut down the port engine. He shut down the port engine because he was losing control, because the starboard engine that failed, the propellers did not feather. And on those Garrett motors, and I know because I've flown them for 4,500 hours out of Lanseria Airport.
Right.
If the engine fails and the propeller doesn't feather, the aircraft immediately starts to roll, because the propeller is so big, and being like a big disc in the wind, it actually starts to put the aircraft out of control. So he reduced power on the port engine, on the left engine, to regain control. But of course, in doing that, he lost all his power, almost all of it. So then he had to look for a forced landing area, which he did. He found the only available area, which was leading into the school grounds, and he put it down in a very, very efficient way. But unfortunately, when it went through the fence, it hit a culvert, badly damaged the aircraft. He got severely injured. The other two, the flight attendant and the first officer, were also injured. And of course, he died a couple of weeks later. But if you go to the accident report from the Civil Aviation Authority, and I think I sent you that extract.
Yes, I've actually just put that up on the screen.
Okay, so if I just show you or just explain that, you don't have to be an aviation expert to understand what's going on here. So it says, and all of this comes out of the South African Civil Aviation Accident Report. The extracts below confirm this. In addition, this ill-informed statement from the report: when he increased power to 104%, both lateral and directional control was lost because aileron and rudder deflections were too small. Control was regained following the inadvertent shutdown of the left engine. Now, that wasn't inadvertent. He was going out of control. It seems unbelievable that such an obvious contradictory lack of understanding is documented in a formal final accident report. It shows a complete lack of understanding of the operation of the Garrett engines and negative torque sensing system. The negative torque sensing system is the system that automatically feathers the propellers if the engine starts to fail or does fail. It is known that if the NTS system fails and the propellers do not go to feather, the aircraft becomes uncontrollable unless it's reduced. Power is reduced on the live engine. So then we go down to 3.1.8. The torque of the operating left engine was allowed to decrease to 80% following the failure of the right engine. When the torque of the left engine was again increased to 104%, both lateral and directional control was lost because aileron and rudder deflections were too small. So that's just reiterating what was said above.
Right.
And then 2.30, all indications are that the right propeller was not feathered on impact. So here again, they're confirming that the right propeller was not feathered, therefore it was going out of control with power on the left engine, therefore he shut down power. And then on the final approach for the forced landing, he correctly shut down the left engine, which shuts down fuel and everything else to avoid a fire.
Right.
So it was not his fault, absolutely clear cut. And then you go to the flight data recorder document, which is on there as a graph as well. And that document then confirms exactly what is described here, what I've described here.
Right. Now, you must come across some pretty amazing accidents and acts of stupidity. What's the stupidest thing you've seen a pilot do in the accidents that you've actually investigated?
Well, there are many and varied. I can't mention the name of the organization because we're in the middle of an accident investigation with one here in Australia with a helicopter accident. But the issue comes in with usually with a pilot, when he does something stupid, it's more a peer pressure or a company pressure type arrangement where he's being pressured to fly in an overloaded situation where he shouldn't. So he'll be flying an aircraft or a helicopter. They overload it with passengers, with fuel. They take off, and in normal flight, there's no problem. But then you go into a valley and you hit turbulence, and you turn out of wind, and then suddenly you lose control, and there's an accident. So most of the accidents that we deal with are along those sorts of lines.
Right. Now, just turning our attention back to South Africa again, just briefly. Sorry, guys. Just wait for this. Yeah, if we're having fun with your internet, you're back. Now, Colin, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
I have been all the time, yeah.
Okay, right. It's just your internet's playing around with us.
Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh, gee.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm here, Scott.
Hi, Colin. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. I don't know why it's going off.
Yeah.
My side should be okay.
Yeah, it's just a quirk of the internet. Now, one of the areas that we should also touch on is charges against the former civil aviation chief executive Trevor Abrahams in South Africa. And this is to do with, of all things, a pilot scam probe. What's that all about?
Well, and here again, as an individual that I got on very well with, there was no problem until we got drawn in and became the person in the middle of two parties who were trying to sort out what was going on. And of course, like the accident investigations we do, we end up in all sorts of trouble, because if we do it properly and we don't give in with certain things and we don't get influence to change a report, as happens all the time, then we end up in trouble. So the pilot license scam is well documented in South Africa. It was an arrangement whereby examination papers were that were preset were sold to individuals that were coming in to write the exams. And on the day they came in, the exam that they had paid for was set up so they knew what the answers were. And we found out, we were able to identify probably about 15 people that had a pilot license scam. But the issue came in because there were two fatal accidents.
Wow.
And both pilots were involved in the pilot license scam. They had, the one guy had a commercial license and he had a fraudulent airline transport pilot license. The other one had a private pilot's license, and he had a commercial license that had gone through this fraudulent system. And then they had accidents. So the lawyers called us in to assist them. We analyzed everything, and to our absolute amazement, we found out that it was in the examination department at the Civil Aviation Authority. So the lawyers drew up a list of questions. I went with them, and that was put to the board with Trevor Abrams, Vicky Buxton, and others who were there at the time. And it was a please explain. They couldn't explain. So the lawyers took it to the public prosecutor in Pretoria, and in about 1 hour of examining the documentation, they put out a warrant of arrest for Trevor Abrams. And he was put in jail for about 2 or 3 days, and then he was let out. Whereas the charges against him, if it had been a normal system, would have probably put him in jail for 10 or 15 years or something like that. But anyway, that's basically how the system worked. And of course, then it got worse and worse from there. There was an arbitration hearing that I went to, and then there was targeting against the other individual that I was involved with in the investigation, Mani Esthuizen, who lost a son in one of these accidents. And his family was targeted, and then there was a kidnap attempt on my children at the school in Pretoria.
Wow.
So at that stage, we were put under police protection, taken out to, a few weeks later, taken out to Oliver Tambo, put on an aircraft, and we were flown back to Australia because we were all on Australian passports at that stage.
Wow, so the threat to you personally and your family was just escalating as a result of this.
It was very, very severe because there were a whole lot of other issues all tied into that, but we were under a lot of threat with what was going on. So the right thing to do was to get out of there simply because we could and come back.
Well, I understand that the ex-CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, is leaving South Africa, basically on the next plane. He said that his life's under so much threat now because he's exposed the ANC corruption, the direct involvement of the ANC political party in the corruption at Eskom, that he is now basically a target for assassination.
Yeah, and we read all the reports over here. The assassination risk for anybody is very high. It's a very cheap process to hire a hitman, and it's just part of the failure of the system, which is very, very sad. Because when I think back to my Air Force days and what it was like in those days, and the professionalism and everything that was in place, it's just very sad. Yeah.
Look, South Africa is a basket case. I mean, everybody knows that, and it's absolutely tragic what's happened. So the ANC have got to go. Now, just on a couple of topical issues related to planes and safety. I was horrified when I saw in your notes that you said that they're now talking about, with some airlines, only having one crew member in the cockpit. In other words, they don't have a supporting crew member in case the pilot has a heart attack or something like that. Well, what exactly is that all about? Because that sounds terribly unsafe.
Well, when I first read this, I laughed and I couldn't believe it. Then we started investigating it, and to my absolute horror, we found that, and they named certain airlines that are involved in trying to implement this, and they are trying to implement this with ICAO, and whether they get it right or not, I don't know. And what they're saying is that the aircraft will be modified with electronic devices to compensate this, compensate that. You can never compensate for an incapacitated pilot.
Yeah.
So, and you've just got to go onto Google and do a search on pilot incapacitation, and it happens all the time. So to have an airliner with 400 people on board and have a pilot that's collapsed at the controls is a horror scene that you cannot even imagine. For them to even consider this shows only one thing. It shows that money or cost is overriding safety, and that is what we unfortunately are finding. So after 62 years in aviation, the evolution of the way this has gone, with this issue with incentive bonuses and cost saving, has now gone completely out of control. And if this did happen, it would be the worst disaster of all time, because there would be an accident and it would be directly related to this. But they look at it as, okay, we can afford to lose an aircraft here and there if we save this much money. That's how the concept in this type of thinking works.
But an aircraft costs millions of dollars. Surely an extra pilot in there is not going to cost that much extra for wages?
No, you would think that it would never even cross anybody's mind in the safety departments or the executive management side of these airlines or whatever operation it is. But unfortunately, and you'll get a safety department with 10 people involved who are very proficient and they know what they're doing, but go up 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, and start going into the executive accounting side of things and the accountable management side, and their bottom line is money. It's often not people. It's not always the case. There are some airlines that would not do that. They definitely would not do that. But unfortunately, the trend, and that's what I'm talking about, it's the trend, the way things are going in aviation is very disturbing, because they've lost sight of cost against safety. And we deal with this every day of our lives, to the point that, it affects our business, because if we try and do something and insist on something to be like equipment put on the aircraft, and don't want to do it, then we take the hit.
Wow. So they're putting money before safety.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Not everybody and not all the time, but it's there and it's crept in and it's increasing all the time.
Now,
that's the worrying.
Gavin's in the side chat has raised an interesting point. He says the aircraft are insured, so the airline does not lose. Their insurance does. Now, surely if they go into a standard which puts the entire aircraft at risk, the insurance company could say no?
Yes, they could. But remember that the insurance companies are also a business, And it's also, if the airline has got 30 aircraft or 40 aircraft, and there's a risk of them losing all that business to another insurer, then we start getting back into the same thin ice area.
Wow. So what we're actually saying here is that people's lives are basically put on the back burner, and it's all about profit.
Well, it's like a comparison between money against lives, and quite often in terms of certain aspects of aviation, the risk is worked out as to what is likely to happen, how many lives would be lost, as to what the actual cost of the changes would be that people are trying to bring in, that sort of thing. So that's not a new thing, but it comes back to the same old ingredient as the thing has gone out of control. And that's the problem that we're dealing with now, all the time.
Now, Clive said that in any cockpit for overseas flights, there should be a pilot, a co-pilot, and a navigator. That's how I remember it used to be, or a first engineer in the cockpit. So what you're saying now is there will just be one person in the cockpit, and that'll be the pilot.
Yes, the engineer or the navigator, third crew member, was done away with a long time ago. And that's acceptable because with the advance of electronic navigational systems, that aspect is not as critical as it was. As far as the engineering side is concerned, if the aircraft can communicate with the ground as they can do now on the ACAS system or whatever system they have, then one can also say, okay, well, one could justify doing that, but to take a second pilot away is obviously unacceptable.
Yeah. Well, I remember so well when I was a young boy flying down to South Africa from East Africa, and the pilot on the plane, it was a Fokker Friendship back then, and the pilot on the plane was the father of one of the kids who went to the same school, and he used to invite us into the cockpit, and we would sort of stand there, and it was just amazing. I mean, looking down, because the Fokker Friendship, it doesn't fly at the height of the Boeings do, and I think it was flying at about 10,000 meters, or about 30,000 feet, and yes. You could look down and you could see the African villages down below, and all the kids running around because they heard the plane and they'd all be pointing. It was just absolutely remarkable. I'll never forget those times. Now,
yeah, that was done away with 9/11 when they brought in the lock
yes.
cockpit door scenario and nobody being allowed into the cockpit. That's where that ended. But it was like that before. You're quite right.
Yeah.
I can remember that too.
Just on that locked door situation, okay, here's the scenario. You've got only one crew member in the cockpit, that's the pilot. You've got a locked door now, and you've got the rest of the crew on the outside. What happens if that pilot has a heart attack? Is that the end of the plane? I mean, can no one get in there to take over?
Most of those systems, and it might vary, but most of the systems operate with the crew member inside the cockpit releasing the door. And the reason for that is you could have a flight attendant on the other side of the door with a knife to her throat being told, give me the code to get into the cockpit. So they do not allow that. It has to be operated from inside the cockpit.
So what happens if that one crew member dies? Is that it?
Well, if he's incapacitated or he dies, it doesn't matter whether the door's locked or not. It's going to be the same end result.
The plane's going to go down?
Yes.
Wow. Now, do we have a list of which airlines are doing this? Because I would never fly in one of those.
If you do a search on Google,
yeah.
Rather than me try and sort of remember which ones, but I distinctly remember when I started responding to this on my Facebook and our LinkedIn site,
yeah,
where we put in resistance to this in a big way. At that time, there were 3 airlines that had got on board that were actively involved together in trying to get this through. So to get an updated number or who they are, a Google search will confirm that.
Wow. So you just, do one crew member in cockpit or something like that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, let me just type that down. One crew member in cockpit. I'm going to do a search on this. Because, wow, if I fly, I don't want to be flying on a plane that's going to go one person in the cockpit. Now, just on that, a related issue, Colin, we've just gone through this COVID pandemic. Okay, now I normally call it something else, but I'm going to be nice. And one of the groups who were basically forced to get the experimental jab were pilots. Now, I'm hearing that quite a few pilots have had adverse reactions as a result of having the vax. Is it true or is it not true that the airlines are now trying to get pilots or recruit pilots who are unvaccinated?
I'm not sure about that aspect, but what I do know is the results of COVID itself and the vaccinations in my immediate circle with family members, with friends, and people that we deal with all the time. And it's a shocking picture. It really is. I mean, I've got a brother-in-law that's gone blind in one eye.
Oh no.
I've got a sister-in-law that's got long COVID, and she's in a desperate state, and so the list goes on. It's everywhere. So what you're saying is quite likely because of the unknown areas, and if that is the case, if they're trying to get crew who haven't been vaccinated or haven't had COVID, how does that relate back to the single crew operation with incapacitation?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I guess sooner or later one of these planes is going to lose the guy in the cockpit, and then you don't know where it's going to land. It could land in the city of London when it runs out of petrol, or fuel. You just don't know where it's going to land, do you?
Well, the only thing you do know is that it's going to crash.
Yeah.
And that the chance of people surviving on board that aircraft will be almost nil.
Well, it will be zero.
Yeah, it just cannot happen. And it's not just single crew operations. We're also dealing with other operational issues where people are cutting corners and doing the wrong thing, taking the wrong decision, where they should be acting on the side of safety. They're acting on the side of commercial success or gain, and pushing the boundaries.
Yeah. Well, I know that the price of airline tickets, especially international, since COVID, have gone right through the roof, and I think that's just because they want to recover their costs.
Yeah, well, Qantas is I think 1.5 billion profit is what they've just come up with now.
Yeah.
And prices are still almost double over here.
Yeah. Now, just talking about Qantas, Alan Joyce has been the head of Qantas now for at least 30 years. What are your views on Alan Joyce?
If you're looking at a... Sorry.
If you can comment. Yeah, back to you.
No. We follow these things all the time. So in terms of an effective CEO or accountable manager, an individual like Alan Joyce is extremely effective. He's known as the hatchet man over here. So if times are bad like COVID, they'll get rid of all the ground crew, replace them all, bring in another company at lower cost. That they'll do absolutely anything to save money. In terms of the investors, the shareholders, that is, he's seen as extremely effective. But from our perspective, from the aviation side, it's it's not like that at all, because the emphasis is on money. There's the issue of safety.
Right, and I believe the engineering now has been contracted off to another country for Qantas.
Well, that happened before. It actually they were contracting out to China, and of course that ended up in a disaster, because they found when the aircraft came back they'd been signed off with everything, but not everything had been done. And I think Singapore is now an alternative option, and Singapore are usually very good. So that is a better option. There's no doubt about that.
Right. Okay. So which airline would you fly in if you were flying, or which airlines would you not fly in? I mean, there's no better man to ask than you. So which are your best 5 and which are the worst 5 airlines in the world to fly today?
Well, going back all those years to our first interview, the airline I would not fly with would be South African Airways. And
that's a no-brainer.
And I don't say that out of any bias or anything like that. I say that because of the failures of the system. And you've only got to look at that flight where they went over to pick up the vaccines, where they misjudged the weight of the aircraft. Yes. By, yeah. So and that wasn't the first one. If you go back through a Google search, you'll see that was the second or the third or fourth time that had actually happened. The first times they weren't reported. This last time, it was reported 3 weeks late to South African Civil Aviation Authority, which in itself is a disaster. So if you look at the turmoil and the turbulence within South African Airways, and you look at the corruption, and you look at the parts and what's happening there, I would be very reluctant, and I wouldn't fly with them unless it was an absolute last resort. So to answer your question, I would look at Emirates as being a very good option. And if you look at some of those leading airlines, including Qantas, because even with the problems they've got an extremely good safety record.
Yes, they have.
The people down the executive management side and going into the operational and the maintenance side they've got very, very highly specialized people who understand and will fight against trying to save money and jeopardizing safety. So Qantas would be an option, and Emirates, and then there would be a couple of others in that area, Qatar Airlines, and a couple of those that at that level would also be, in my view, would be acceptable. Where we do risk analyses of different airlines, often for government companies or government personnel and companies, is where we run into the big question marks is in Russia, obviously, and in Africa, and some specific areas within Africa that are higher risk than others. So, and we do an individual assessment of an airline. We might get a request, somebody wanting to fly, they're sending one of their directors out, and we'll do an investigation on that airline. And if necessary, we'll do a desktop audit on them if they can't do an actual audit where the airline is, where the headquarters of the airline is situated.
Well, one of the airlines that I've flown on, which was a really scary journey, was Zimbabwe Airlines. I did that in 2016. I flew Zimbabwe Airlines, and I was freaked out when I realized which plane I was flying on, because this thing looked like it was about 60 years old, and it was really not looking too safe. How would you rate Zimbabwe Airlines, just as a matter of interest?
I would not fly on them for any reason whatsoever, and there's a good single point why I wouldn't do that, and it's the issue of bogus parts and swapping parts from broken aircraft without traceability. So we've done many investigations into traceability of parts, where we've gone in and done an audit of an airline, and then we've audited the maintenance side, and we've looked at the traceability of the parts. And in some instances, we found that 45% of the parts on one aircraft in Indonesia were not traceable.
Wow.
And we know why that is. It's because this particular airline, who's well known over there, when we went down to do the maintenance audit, outside the hangar there were about 20 old broken aeroplanes with flat tires, wings come off, and in various phases of disrepair. And when we went into the maintenance section to the chief engineer, I jokingly said to him, I said, "Is that your spare parts department out there? Parked out there?"
Yeah.
Anyway, he didn't think that was funny, and I soon found out why, because they had a big bench where they'd taken parts off all these aircraft. They hadn't even cleaned them, hadn't marked them, hadn't traced them, and when somebody needed a part that had failed, they'd come in and take one of these parts off the counter, off this metal bench, and they'd go and put it on the aircraft, and if it worked, they'd fly.
Wow.
That's why I wouldn't fly with it.
Wow. And that was Zimbabwe Airlines?
No, it wasn't. It was actually an Indonesian airline. In this, but we've seen it all over the place.
Right.
It's if we went into and did an audit on the Zimbabwean aircraft that you flew on and gave you a report on untraceability or untraceable parts, you would think back however you could have ended up on that aircraft.
Colin, look, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've been chatting for about an hour, and it's lovely to see you again, mate. It's, as I said, it's been about 4 years now since we last had you on, and things have changed since then. Now, is there any red flags that you want to mention to people regarding what's happening in the aviation industry?
The one area that's causing us a lot of concern at the moment, and you've got to keep in mind that it doesn't apply to a normal corporate operation where you've got a company that's running a business and trying to save money and bringing in an incentive bonus scheme, which has been happening for years and years and years. An incentive bonus scheme where they're given a budget, and whatever they can save on the budget, they'll get a commission on the money they save.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. But where it becomes a bad thing is when you cross the line into aviation, because as soon as you cross the line into aviation, you've now created a conflict between the likes of us as the aviation specialists and the company and the executive side of the company and the accountants who are trying to save money. And Newcrest is a classic example.
Yeah.
Where we were overridden, and that's not the first one. Remember, we've been over here in Australia for many years, and we've done over 3,000 audits now. You can imagine the depth of these findings with this sort of thing and the evolution as it's gone forward as to how things have deteriorated.
Yeah. Wow.
So incentive bonuses in aviation is a nightmare.
Now just a complete left field thought went through my head. These drones, everybody's got a drone now. And these drones can cause a huge amount of problem for big passenger planes, can't they? I mean, if one of those is sucked into an engine.
If one of those goes into an engine, the engine will fail, without doubt.
So, do you see drones as a major danger for passenger aviation going forward?
It depends on the area that you're flying in, because in Australia, for example, and I know South Africa is also in the lead on all of this sort of thing. There are regulations that have been brought in here that all drones have to be licensed. All drone pilots have to have a drone pilot's license. So within the control area like that, in a reputable area of operation from a civil aviation point of view, it's not. There is a risk, but it's not as bad as a country like maybe in the middle of Africa, where someone has got a drone and he's flying it, and flying it near an airport, and not realizing what's actually happening with aircraft coming in or aircraft departing.
Yeah, because I bought a drone through eBay. It cost me about $120, I think it is. I mean, this thing probably only flies for 5 minutes, but it'll take some video footage and from the air. I didn't have to have a license for that.
No, well, they licensed in terms of the weight of the drone, but
right.
So under a certain weight, but then of course the other regulations still apply, like distance from an airport, height that it can fly at.
Yeah,
that still applies. So if it's enforced, then that's the best that can happen to keep it safe.
Right. Okay. Colin, thank you so much for joining us. And it must be about 6 a.m. your time down there in the southern states.
Well, it's 4 minutes past 6, and I just want to say also it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to sort of update the situation as we see it now.
Right. Okay, thanks, Colin. Have a great evening. Or, I'm sorry, I'm talking to people in South Africa. Have a great day, because we're just kicking off our day here, we'll catch up again in the future.
Thank you, Scott. Talk soon.
Okay, bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, guys, that was Colin Weir, and yeah, look. Great to have a man with that sort of level of expertise, as a number of people in the side chat said. And great to know what's happening in the aviation industry, especially if you're just about to take off on an international flight somewhere. And I'm actually looking at doing that next month, just letting the cat out of the bag here. I'm looking at going to Fiji for a couple of weeks, but I'll tell you more about that closer to the time. All right, guys, take care. Have a great evening. And I'm going to go out with Hier Bly Ek Boer. And thanks to the mods for looking after the side chat. And don't forget, tomorrow night, I've got Dr. Elapen Repiti on at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time. And we're going to be having a fiery discussion about what the heck is going on with that taboo subject I can't mention here on YouTube. All right, here we go. Take care, guys. Bye for now.
Meer as 61,000 van ons voorvaders het op die grens van ons gesterwe, sodat ons vry kan wees. Die is my land, die is my reg, hier is ek boer. Van stof is ek gemaak en sal ek terugkeer. Die Bybel is die woord waaruit ek leer, soos die grond op die aarde. Hier bly ek boer. So diep in die nacht sal die vyand kom, maar hier bly ek staan en ek draai nie om, want jy maak my nie bang nie. Hier bly ek boer. Die is my land waarvoor ek sal veg. Die is my bloed, my zweet, my rug. Die is die plek waar my voorvaders leef. Die is my land, hoor wat ek jou sê. Die is my land, wat my mense voer. Hier bly ek boer. Soos blaatsam in die somer wat vreugde bring, my oupa wat maniekie kon sing, soos hy stap deur die lande. Hier was hy boer. My wortels lê diep in die grond geplant. Hy sien soos my Die Liefsalkom.